not on the reading list. I don't know why I didn't have it on the reading list for Spirit of Christianity. Is a deconstructed reading by Werner Hammer. Pleroma, reading Hegel, which reads it completely differently than I do. So if you want the anti-Bernsteinian reading, this is emphatically it. You can criticize my reading point by point. Everything I say will be false. Werner is also one of the best readers in America, or Germany, wherever he happens to be at the moment. He's here. He's down in my unit now? Yeah. So he's just down the block, and he knows how to read superbly. Okay, let's begin. At some point, we'll get a class list to pass around, but we don't have one yet. So we'll just do some philosophy. I am assuming that, as you know, on the syllabus, I say topics, not weeks. I'm assuming that it will take me about 2 weeks to get through this text. I can drag it out, but I'll see if I can do it in 2 weeks. I will do it in 2 weeks, but I don't think I can do it in a week. And this is one occasion where if you have no desire to take notes, you can avoid doing so, since the essay by me in your syllabus this is an occasion where I've written on this text, and I don't have anything wildly different to say than what I've already written. So you can just relax, listen, enjoy it, and then if you want to read what I have to say, that's fine. So this is just going to be a version of that. Okay, last week, one further thing. First of all, I've been up since 6 this morning working, so I've already put in a 14-hour day, which means I may not be completely cogent. So if you're thinking, wait, that doesn't make any sense, it's probably because it doesn't, in which case, please stop me, please ask questions. That's the right thing to do. And it helps me. It doesn't interrupt my flow. It really helps me see what I'm saying and the like. So please feel free. Last week I offered an epistemological introduction to the Phenomenology, suggesting that Hegel's move was from I think to we think, in which the we think was the removal of any externality. Hence the idea of idealism as being infinite. And I tried to say the notion of infinite is not anything beyond the world, it's the critique of Kant. Right? It's a critique of Kant's infinitude. And I want to repeat that argument this week by offering an ethical introduction to Hegel. And I should say right away that the whole trick of the phenomenology of spirit is to connect these two problematics, the epistemological and the ethical. And the reason I want to go back to this early essay of Hegel's, 1798-99, is first of all, it is the most readable text Hegel ever wrote. Dilthey says Hegel never wrote anything finer, and I agree with that. But I also prefer it over Hegel's Jena writings, the other bit of early or young Hegel, because in those writings, Hegel is already beginning to work out his system. And what I think about this text is it does not represent Hegel's system. I want to be clear. It represents his ethical and philosophical vision. And it represents his vision better than, I think, those other writings. It shows you what he really wanted to say, what he really cared about. Now, what he wanted to say and what he really cares about is here embedded in, as I'll say more about in one moment, a wholly spurious ontology of life and law. And it's this spurious metaphysics of love and life that he eventually has to get rid of, and I'll explain how he does that in a moment. So, this is, and it's typical Hegel, this is Hegel, all this text, every moment of it, when you read it, is about the critique of Kant. It's about the critique of Kant's moral philosophy. Nothing else is at stake. He's thinking about Kant in every single sentence, and he's thinking about two things. He's thinking about the general structure of Kant's moral philosophy, which I'll describe as him finding intolerable in various ways. And of course, he's also modeling this text, again in ways I'll elaborate, after Kant's own philosophical reading of Christianity, namely religion within the limits of reason alone. What Hegel wants to do here is replace Kant's morality of universal law with some notion, what I'm going to call ethical living, or some notion of the structural contours of human experience as such. Now, Hegel's idealism is constituted, or so I'm going to argue for the next 27 weeks, by this identification of the normative logic of ethical life, the normative logic of ethical life is going to be identified with the structure of experience as such. So the idea is we're going to get a notion of what ethical interaction is, and we're going to use that to model our relationship to the world in general. So this is, if I may steal a phrase from a philosopher I despise, namely, this is ethics as first philosophy. And this is really, as I suggested last week, getting rid of epistemology as first philosophy. That is, the representational idea that we stand in relation to the world by means of representing it, and replacing it by an ethical relationship. At the center of Hegel's ethical vision in this essay is what has come to be known as through Habermas, is the causality of fate. It's he who actually gave it this title. And the causality of fate is an ethical logic of action and reaction. The thought is, this is just Hegel's thought, if he has a thought, which, by the way, he stole from Fichte, so it's not original. It's something you all should think about. Philosophy is one area where you don't have to be original. To be a good thief. A good thief is the most one can achieve. Hegel was not a good, but a great thief. And he stole this idea from Fichte. The thought is to act against another person. To do what we nowadays call acting immorally or acting wrong. Is not to break some transcendent law, but to destroy your own life. That when you act wrongly, you call down the avenging fates. And therefore, the thought is you cannot ethically harm another without ethically harming yourself. That all, we might say, wrongful action, let's call it, since I'm going to end this today by talking about the logic of love, let's call it breaking the bonds of love. To break the bonds of love is to destroy the other and yourself simultaneously. In this way, this logic of the causality of fate is right, then the flourishing and foundering of each life is intimately bound up with the flourishing and foundering of everyone's life. As the young Marx said, right? As long as one is unfree, then all are unfree. The question is, how do we make that thought true? It's going to take us 28 weeks to get that thought in place. It's a hard and difficult thought, and I'm not convinced it works. But we're going to try, because if ethicality isn't about this, then it probably isn't about anything worth knowing at all. Well, that's my view. So, social space, as I'm going to think of it, is always constituted ethically, normatively, as a space in which subjects are necessarily formed or deformed, freed or oppressed through the structures governing their interactions with one another, and with nothing beyond that. Nothing beyond that. So Hegel thinks, and this is his disturbing thought, I guess, is that ethical life matters independently of any particular moral norms, moral principles, moral laws, or moral ends. Ethical life is going to be about the quality of our intersubjective life, not about our relationship to some abstract norms. Now, all this, again, is embedded in an inadequate holistic metaphysics of love and life. By this thought, I mean two things. First, that the metaphysics of this essay is emphatically a metaphysics of life and love. Now, to say that it's so that life and love are here going to be Hegel's first idea about the invisible or secret bonds connecting us with one another. Now, we're connected by participating in a life together, where the notion of life must be read in two ways. That, first of all, the notion of life together is the sense of having a life, like get a life. We say get a life. We don't mean you're not alive. We mean get into connection with what you need to get into connection with, in order that, the second thought now, is that this has something to do with vitality and being alive in the biological sense. So that practical life and being alive are going to be thought to be interconnected. Now, there's a great debate about this text. The Great Debate is it an anti-theological document or a theological document? Well, certainly this much is true. It is anti-theological in the sense that Hegel is going to suggest that all Christian God talk is simply a means for expressing the metaphysics of life and love. So that to talk about God is just another way about talking about ethical life. That's the sense in which it's anti-theological. That is, it gets rid of any notion of a transcendent God. That simply is kaput. And it's kaput for Hegel from the get-go. There's never any transcendent God in Hegel. So the only question is whether there is an immanent God. And this is the old pantheism problem. Is pantheism a form of theism or a form of atheism? Who knows? I mean, if you know the answer to that question, you should be up here telling us it's very hard. It's fraught, and it's certainly fraught in this essay, and it remains fraught in Hegel. My thought is that, or my belief about it, is simply that insofar as there is no transcendent God, then there is an inevitable drift within pantheism toward atheism, and that there is nothing to prevent that drift. And I believe that that's Hegel's thought. That is, secularism is the correct fate of religion. Now, in translating Christianity into ethical terms, Hegel is simply following the model of Kant's religion within the limits of reason alone, since that's what Kant did, right? He read the Bible, and he just translated into Kantian moral philosophy. And indeed, Hegel had already done that in an earlier piece called The Life of Jesus, rewritten in the same text. In fact, it is the same text, because at that point, the argument is perfectly Kantian. At a certain moment, sometime in the late 1790s, Hegel realizes that Kant is the problem and not the solution. And this is him working through the thought that Kant is the problem. So the idea is to show that there is a logic of experience implicit in early Christianity. It's simply there. In fact, actually, what Hegel thinks is that, and this can be baffling when you read it, because what Hegel thinks, and this is kind of one of the tricks of the text, is that Jesus is doing practically, namely revealing the ethical content of theological discourse that Hegel is doing theoretically. I.e., Hegel and Jesus are doing the same thing, only, Hegel's doing it a little later and theoretically. But the realization is that that's what Jesus was doing. He is a theological, he's a decoder of theology. He's bringing theology back to life. He's replacing law with love. I mean, that's what he says over and over again. And, the only problem is 2,500 years of Christianity, 2,100 years, have completely misunderstood him. have ignored what Jesus was doing, have tried to make him a transcendent thinker rather than an immanent one. So there's a kind of heresy in this book, that is Hegel's identification with Jesus. Still, the model here is much more modest. And the model, again, is Kant's religion book. So we ought to retitle Hegel's essay and call it Religion Within the Limits of Life Alone. That's the project. Religion within the limits of life alone. And the thought is, when you do the decoding, there is no excess and no remainder. Nothing left for God to be but our relationship to one another. Second, I said that it's an inadequate holistic metaphysic of life. To say that it's a metaphysics of life is first of all to say it's a logic of part and whole, which we saw was the discovery of reading the Third Critique, that you could replace relationships of universal to particular with relationships of part and whole. Put that at the top of your page. That movement is all this text rehearses. It sets up the structure of universal and particular. Let's call it Noah, Abraham, the state, positive law, Kant, and replaces it with the logic of part and whole. Call it love, call it Jesus, call it life. Now, why that movement should be revolutionary, that's what we've got to figure out. But that's the structure. So, like everything in philosophy, it's always a matter of boring logic. The exciting stuff always has beneath it a conceptual scaffolding where all the stakes are. All the stakes are always in the logic, never in the fancy rhetoric. That's a Hegelian thought. Hegel is a crazy kind of logician. Well, to say that it's first part and whole, the other thing is to talk about life means that we can begin to talk about a language of living and dying, since things that are alive can also die. Things that are alive can also be injured. They can suffer. They can hurt in various ways. So introducing a language of life is also going to be a way of naturalizing ethical language, or bringing ethical language back to, let's call it, the vicissitudes of the body as the model for the vicissitudes of the spirit. I'll say that again. Use the vicissitudes of the body, the way it suffers pains and harms and injuries, as a way of mapping and structuring the vicissitudes of spirit. That is, when your lover spurns you hurt. When you get called a name by hate speech, it's a form of injury. When you feel yourself spurred or demeaned or humiliated or without stature or standing in the world, you suffer. We have got to find ways of making what sounds at first like a metaphorical transition from body talk into moral talk. We want to find ways of making that as literal as possible, so that we don't need any other talk other than our ordinary talk of injury, wounding, hurt, harm, and suffering, living and dying. We live and die biological death, but we also live and die, as everyone knows, spiritual deaths. Well, there's good reason to use the language of life here. Unfortunately, if you use the language of life, you end up with a kind of garbage pantheism. That's what's wrong with it. So Hegel's going to have to get rid of the notions of love and life as his model and replace it. In place of love, he's going to have the notion of recognition. And in place of life, he's going to have the notion of spirit. That's the translation manual that will get you from this essay to the Phenomenology. Okay. That's what we want to work out over the next 3.5 hours. Okay. I'm ready to begin. I don't know what to say to the charge that this is an anti-Semitic text, except to say that I find no evidence anywhere in Hegel that he was an anti-Semite. I think, if anything is a problem here, it's that he's simply insensitive to these issues in the extreme. He just doesn't see them. Which is all I have to say about the matter. Okay, let's begin. Although Hegel regards Abraham as the true progenitor of the Jews, it's not unimportant that he begins this story with an account of the flood and of the contrast between Noah and Nimrod on the one hand and Deucalion and Pyrrha on the other. So how does this text start? Why does he start with the flood? Well, in a sense, he starts with the flood because the flood is what destroys the state of nature. Where the state of nature is that time when man and nature lived in a state of harmony. The state of nature here is not Hobbesian state of nature. It's kind of paradisiacal. It's a good time had by all. And then comes the flood. Hegel says of the flood that it was destructive, invincible, irresistible hostility, and manslaughter. Which reveals what? What does it reveal? What does the flood reveal to us?
Nature doesn't give a damn about us?
Nature doesn't give a damn. It's nature's indifference to the human that is revealed, and that leads to a certain problem, namely, we've got to cope with nature, which is to say, we have to control and master it. So the point of beginning with Noah is to show that Western rationality is emerging at this very moment. Nothing earlier than Noah. And Western rationality that begins with Noah emerges in response to the need to master threatening nature. This is not Adorno and Horkheimer, this is Hegel. Just so happens Adorno and Horkheimer read Hegel. Okay? So, the claim is going to be, first of all, the first thing that this tells us is that this text is a genealogy of moral reason, that the critique of Kantian morality is different than it's going to be in the Phenomenology. We're going to be sick to death of criticizing Kant, but this is going to be a different one. This is going to be a genealogical critique by showing that the fundamental gestures of Kant's philosophy repeats the earliest gestures of the emergence of reason that occurs with the emergence of Judaism. And the emergence of Judaism is all a unraveling of the logic of the response to the flood by Noah and Nimrod. So that Western rationality has as its fundamental contours the idea of the mastery of nature, and that the deep understanding of Judaism, of course, nothing to do with God. God is always a red herring in any argument. You always have to figure out, in any argument, what God means. And the notion of God signifying this or that just simply varies from context to context. But it's never, never about God. It's always about, it has to be about, because there is no God. I mean, that's why. Punchline, there is none. If that's a shock to anyone, I'm really sorry. But there is no God. Ergo, whenever we see the word God, we've got to figure out what it means by figuring out what it implies for our relationships to one another, to the world. That's the only thing that can be at stake. So every concept of God is a concept of a life of a certain kind that is a picture of a certain kind of life. I just take that to be a gimme for grown-ups. I take it we have people who share this great nation of ours who are not grown-ups. Some say even the president. So the thought here is that what is going to be called the deforming and perverse quality of Jewish life, the criticism of Judaism, and hence the deforming and perverse quality of Kantian reason, derives from the fact that it appropriates a form of rationality designed to master hostile nature. That the inner structure of morality, I'm going to argue, is a replication of the rationality for the mastery of nature, and it applies the logic for the mastery of nature onto human relations so that we subject ourselves to the same logic to which we have subjected nature. So it is going to be a story of what we might call instrumental reason all the way down. Now, it should not be surprising to us that the fundamental critique of Kant should be a critique of him as a repetition of instrumental reason, because the fundamental gesture of Kant's philosophy was a critique of instrumental reason. That's what it was all about. When Kant says, I had to limit reason in order to make room for faith, he could have said, I need to limit instrumental reason, that is the reason of Newtonian scientific reason, the reason of the logic of cause and effect, so the reason that understands the world through scientific rationality. Kant realized, this is beautifully done in a book by Richard Belkley. What's the name of Belkley's book? Remember? No? Yeah, he follows the Belkley line. Well, they were undergraduate students at Penn State. Anyway, Richard Belkley.
Freedom and the End of Reason.
Thank you. Freedom and the End of Reason. Really wonderful book about understanding, really understanding Kant is coming out of Rousseau in a certain way. But the thought is something like this, that Kant realized that if Newtonian science represented all the notion of rationality and truth in the world, then two things arose. First, the one we all know about. If everything is governed by the laws of cause and effect, then there is no freedom. But secondly, and this is what really did it for Kant, if everything is governed by the laws of cause and effect, then we can understand science either. Because science is a human product. The notion of truth is a human idea. And Kant realized that in order to preserve the value of truth, right, it was Kant who discovered that truth has a value, right, not Nietzsche, then we had to limit science, bring it within a notion of self-determining reason, and furthermore, show that there was a different logic of morality. Okay? So Kant's project was a critique of instrumental reason. That was its purpose. Now, what Hegel's simply going to argue is he didn't succeed because his own idea of moral reason is actually the same as his notion of theoretical reason. That practical reason and theoretical reason are not sufficiently different, and that therefore the same logic that he criticized, he also brought into morality. Okay. Hegel proposes that there are just two fundamental ways in which one can master nature. Either through something real, that is, through some collective practical activity, like building a city or building a tower or building a boat, or if you're the Dutch, building a wall. You got to do something. And that's, no avoiding that. And that's Nimrod's solution. Or through something thought. And this is going to be Noah's solution, which is here presented as the invention of the Jewish God. But it's Noah who invented the Jewish God. And this involves two steps. First, the posing of an ideal, things ought to be different from this, against hostile nature, and then, why not? If you're going to have an ideal, you might as well give it some oomph. So let's say that the second step is giving the ideal reality, being. Well, take an ideal, let's call it the ideal of the good, and give it reality, give it being, and what do you got? You got God. That's how you get God quickly. Now, the thought then is, of course, that God's the master of the world. So God's a kind of transcendental ego. He gives us the contours of the world. And therefore, all the world is essentially a thought reality, because all the world is nothing but an object of God's intellect. Well, this is puzzling, or you should be puzzled. Because what you want to ask is, how does thinking about God as the master of nature help me master nature? There's got to be a missing step. Well, of course, again, there is no God. So I'm going to say that the missing step is what I call the theological contract. And the idea of the theological contract is simply this. God promises to restrain the forces of nature on the condition that human beings master their nature. Nature within Namely, we master our murderous, incestuous, desiring hearts by obeying fundamental laws of conduct. So the thought is, because God's relationship to nature is actually always mediated by what? By our relation to ourselves, that is, by human obedience, then the ebb and flow of nature in relation to man is only ever a register of human obedience and disobedience. Or what is to say the same thing, nature from this perspective is never anything but a sign of man's relationship to God. Nature is hostile, we've been sinning. If nature is kind, then we've been good. And that's the way it works. Now, since nature is almost always hostile, then we are almost always sinning, and therefore we are a stiff-necked and hard-hearted people, the continuous reiteration of the Old Testament, and we never get it right. Okay, now, therefore, the fundamental stakes about relationship to God is our relationship to ourselves. Therefore, page 187, it was through God alone that Abraham came into a immediate relation with the world, the only kind of link with the world possible for him. Now this is where, so what we're going to imagine is that in the first instance, Abraham has a direct relationship to the world, and then via this story, the relationship is going to go via God, so that Abraham is never in direct relationship to the world. Let's cash that out and see what it means. Noah and Nimrod represent, of course, the two faces of Kant's critical project. Nimrod is a code for the Kantian understanding. Verstand. Noah is a code for reason, or Vernunft. That is, they represent the understanding and reason, respectively. Those are the only two possible relationships to the world imagined by instrumental rationality. They represent two sides of an self-defeating strategy. Hegel says, and this is his thesis, both made a peace of necessity with the foe and thus perpetuated the hostility. Page 184. Both made a peace of necessity. By necessity, they made the peace with their enemy, and that's good, except it's also bad because they thus perpetuated the hostility. This is the brief version in miniature of Hegel's intuition here. And the thought is this, that the logic of causal manipulation and self-subjection to external authority, both these ways of operating, both subjecting nature to law, mastering nature, and subjecting yourself to law, obeying the categorical imperative, right? Those are both versions of the same. And what they do is internalize the conception of the other, nature without and nature within, as antagonists. That is, both ways of relating to the object assume that the only possible relationship of it is it's an antagonist, and therefore you must master it and control it and dominate it. So the only possible relationship to the other is one of domination and control, and no other relationship is possible. Well, this depends upon thinking of, let's call this relationship, the direct one, a horizontal ethical geometry, and we'll call this one a vertical ethical geometry. And the reason why, of course, Hegel is going to argue that every vertical ethical geometry is deforming is because this thing, whether it's the moral law or the idea of the good or God, doesn't exist. Always a problem. So the problem is we're going to project outside of life an idea and subject ourselves to it, and therefore deform these internal horizontal relationships of, again, love and life. So, how does this begin? It begins with Abraham wanting to be autonomous. He wants to be, Hegel says, an independent man, overlord to himself. So for Hegel, Abraham's action of tearing himself free of his family, which for all the world looks like, except he's too old for this, what every adolescent does when it eventually leaves home, that is the normal mechanism for becoming autonomous, is done, and this will be the criticism, with intolerable coldness. And it is the coldness and indifference in the action that qualifies its violence. Abraham tore himself free, I'm quoting now, page 185, and this should be puzzling to you. He tore himself free without having been injured or disowned, without grief, which after a wrong or an outrage signifies love's enduring need, when love, injured indeed but not lost, goes in quest of a new fatherland in order to flourish and enjoy itself there. What is that sentence about? Obviously important. Well, one thing it assumes is this, that there are good grounds for rebelling. There are good grounds for going to seek to found a new state. But this, by the way, is, I'll say more about it in a second, but this is telling you the same story that we get in Greek tragedy. He understands this is the moment for moving from a family, familial social structure to a political social structure. So this is the beginning of Western sociology. And that's clearly what the Judaic story is fundamentally about. It's about the end of family tribal relations and the beginning of political or civil relations between human beings. That is, replacing love by law. This is the inevitable step. What Hegel finds troubling here is why Abraham does this. He doesn't do it because his relations with his others has gone wrong. He doesn't do it because he's been stirred, he's been spurned, or because things have fallen apart, or people can't get on with one another. He does it. Well, why does he do it? Of course, we know why he does it, because God called him. That's what's scary. It's scary because, and I want to be clear, for Hegel, it's scary because there's no human reason why he leaves and breaks up the family. On the contrary, there's something horribly inhuman about Abraham's act. And Abraham, by the way, in this story is a monster. This is why it's a scary story. So the thought is Abraham wasn't injured. He suffered no wrong. He simply... So that Hegel is, of course, suggesting, of course, if things go wrong, then you want to try to do something else. You know, your love fails, you get a divorce, you go looking for, it happens. Right? But that's not this story. Right? There's no injury. Indeed, he says, and I can't think of anything harsher Hegel could say, Abraham wanted not to love. Wanted to be free by not loving. What kind of being is that? Well, it's going to be the being who invents Western rationality. That's the kind of being. But we ought to be clear that Western rationality has built into it this refusal of love as the fundamental ground for our relationships with one another. So the fulfillment of the Noah strategy requires the self-subjection to an ideal, to external and authoritative norms of conduct. To found a nation on this basis is to replace the internal norms of communal sentiment with moral norms, with laws. Hence the thought that this is a repetition of the story of Greek tragedy, that Abraham here, just to anticipate, is going to be very similar to Hegel's Creon, and that Isaac is going to be very similar to, but not as wonderful as, Hegel's Antigone. But the story here is of a similar structure. So we have to understand in the case that Hegel's reading, it is the radical discontinuity between these two forms of social organization, the family and the state, love and law, that is the source of the problem, their discontinuity. Abraham seeks to found a new nation at the behest of a purely abstract or ideal norm, where it is promised and presumed that what this means is the rejection of the utter rejection of all previous, let's call them sentimental forms of human bonding. So this is the replacement of sentiment by concept. So the first act, again I'm quoting, sometimes people think I make these stories up about these texts. So I just want to indicate that I am trying to read it. The first act which made Abraham the progenitor of a nation is the disseverance which snaps the bonds of communal life and love. So Abraham's nation-founding act is a wholesale displacement of sentiment by law. And in doing this, he has to do this, and this is going to be, I'll come back into the second half, he has to do this by separating himself from nature completely. We call this separation from nature completely monotheism, the creation of an invisible, untouchable, unseeable, unthinkable, unknowable God. Page 2045. I'm going to do this quote and then we'll have a break since I'm sweating like a pig here. This is, of course, the passage that a lot of people find unacceptable. It represents the Jewish people as abjects. And I want to suggest it represents them as abjects in pretty much Christavis terms. He says that the great tragedy of the Jewish people is no Greek tragedy. It can rouse neither terror nor pity. For both these arise only out of the fate which follows from the inevitable slip of a beautiful character. It can arouse horror alone. That's the anti-Semitism, right? Horror alone. The fate of the Jewish people is the fate of Macbeth. No Greek tragedy that. Who stepped out of nature itself, clung to alien beings, and so in their service had to trample and slay everything holy in human nature, had at last to be forsaken by his gods, since these were objects and he their slave, and be dashed to pieces on his faith itself. I'm not going to try to do the reading of Macbeth here, although that would be interesting. The thought here is, why is horror the only response? It's a response because what appears here is an abject, and the human becomes abject when it steps out of nature itself, when it's expelled from nature. In so doing, it sheds its human shape and human appearance. Now, the reason why this can arouse us to neither terror nor pity is because it's not quite an intelligible human fate. That is, it's not a fate with which we can in principle identify. So when Hegel says of Abraham, page 186, that he became a stranger on earth, a stranger to the soil and to men alike, we should read this notion of being a stranger in ontological terms. That he is ontologically a stranger because he has shed his likeness to nature. That is, there's no affinity between him and nature, and hence he has lost the physiognomy of the human. Now, of course, repudiation of the human is the most human thing we can do. We do it all the time. But it's not tragic in Hegel's sense, by which he means. He means there's something about the structure that is not further transformable. Once you step out of nature, there's no further step. There's no way we can reclaim you. There's no way we can turn this into, got a lemon, make lemonade. You can't make lemonade out of Abraham. There's nothing good here. this is the epitome of, and here I mean this to sound exactly like Nietzsche, that the fundamental structure here is the human repudiation of the human. We call that morality. Let's have a break and then I'll try to prove that. Yeah, a good break, 15 minutes because it's really hot. There are, I'm told, recordings of the weekly lectures at www.bernsteinpapers.com. And there's also somewhere floating around the web, I'll see if I can find it, also a version of these lectures that I gave in 1994 in Berkeley. And there's a couple of versions on the web. I've been doing this for a while. Someone told me I'm getting better at it, which is very nice to know. Every time I do it, I get it a little better. I think maybe another 10, 15 years I can get it right. And then you can die. Hell of a life. So the question is, how do you manage to substitute the vertical axis for the horizontal axis? How you displace the horizontal axis, which is the relation of us to nature and our others, by a relation to morality or ideality. Yeah, sure.
It's about the non-tragic interpretation of the Abraham story that you were ending with for the break. Is to how you.
This is actually very Kant-esque. You should like this.
I could like it very much.
You're all about the transformable mode of action. Having a future. The thought is the Jews having a future.
That's the thought, isn't it?
That's the thought, which is tough on Israel.
Is the coldness of Abraham is to say his non-humanity or the human refusal of humanity and so forth. How does that not once again institute God on Hegel's part? How does that not reify, in other words, the G on the top of your chalkboard in ways that you were saying also Hegel wants to do away with and bring God back down? In other words, isn't that part of his criticism of Abraham? That by making Abraham into something monstrous, superhuman, more than human, anti-human, reifies the G on the chalkboard.
Okay.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. This is a version of the discussion we were having about non-transformability. Let me discuss that when I discuss the question of Isaac, because that's really where the issue lies, and what that non-transformability means. So that's absolutely the right question. Well, how can any logic be in principle non-transformable? Is the question. And it's a great question. And we'll get there in about 7 or 8 minutes. So the question is how the substitution occurs. And it occurs in just the way of all people Plato says it occurs, namely by making a radical separation between the sensible and the intelligible, where what we mean by the intelligible now is simply not sensible. Right? Then the fundamental notion of the intelligible is that there is no way of sensing it. That is, using whatever senses you have in order to put yourself in relationship to it. So what Judaic autonomy involves, that is, what's going on when God gave Moses some laws, in stone no less, right, is that we get the idea of an utterly non-natural, nonsensible, invisible, wholly unified God. That is a God whose name we cannot even say, cannot be named. So I said last week that to name an object was to kill it, so something you cannot kill because it's never alive, and that therefore every image of which counts as a rejection of which, so idolatry is the super sin, and something that therefore is unseen and therefore necessarily unfelt. So this is a wholesale stepping out of nature. And of course the opposite of this, Hegel simply calls beauty. Beauty is what we mean by the truth in its appearance form. I'll just leave it at that. So it is the radicality of the distinction between the sensible and the intelligible which is going to ontologically structure the distinction between universal and particular. Plato got it right, but not because he was Jewish yet. And it's the making of this into the intelligible which secures its authority. So the authority is its non-sensibility. That it's unchallengeable, and it's also the source of its coldness and the like. The whole world for Abraham regarded as simply his opposite. If he did not take it to be a nullity, he looked on it as sustained by the God who is alien to it. Nothing in nature, all page 187, was supposed to have any part in God. Everything was simply under God's mastery. Because nothing can count against the authority of God, and as you'll discover in my way of thinking about philosophy, the kind of question I keep asking is a question about authority. Maybe this is because I spent too much time in my youth reading Weber. But for Weber, every question is about authority, and I've never known Weber to be wrong about anything. So therefore, the question about truth or goodness or beauty is not what they are, but how do they become authoritative? That is, under what grounds do we obey them? Under what grounds do we value them? Right? So the question of truth is not what is it, but why do we value it? This is what Weber learned from Nietzsche, and why Weber, I would argue, is our only Nietzschean thinker. That's another course. I think Max Weber is the great Nietzschean thinker of the 20th century. Okay, so the authority of God comes from his being one, his being the source of meaning, but because of this, he appears in only one guise, namely as command. That is, we know God, that's page 196, I'm quoting Hegel there. So the thought is God is nothing but what? A categorical imperative. That before, and this of course is clear by the way in even textual biblical literature, the question of God is fearing God, obeying God. Fear and obey is very similar in Hebrew. It's the question of having that sense that you don't know God, you do what he tells you to do. So that command rather than truth is the first step. And in a sense, we may say that puts God outside the realm of evidence and rational criticism. Now, all of this, for Hegel, comes to a head in what is, in my knowledge, and I'd like to know if anyone knows different, the first really contrapositive reading of the story of Abraham and Isaac. I don't know of anyone who turns this story around earlier. But he does so. I know, of course, it's now become a cliche of the movies. My favorite account is in, I think, a great movie called The Believer, which is I think, a demonstration that religion's impossible. It's actually a brilliant movie, I think. Right? It's about the Jew who becomes a Nazi, right? In New York. Okay. The near sacrifice of Isaac. Well, in that episode, we find it really playing out of the contest between love and law. Now, for Hegel, it matters terribly, and this is going to part answer Paul's question, that this is the one moment in the Abrahamic narrative in which Abraham is troubled, he is anxious, he is doubtful, his all-exclusive heart could be caused disquiet and even depression. Abraham's hesitation, Hegel says, is the marker, I quote, that love alone was beyond his power. That although he wanted more than anything to obey God, he couldn't stop himself loving his child, loving Isaac, and in a sense knowing that the thought of sacrificing Isaac was maybe not a loving act. So Abraham naturally, and I want to underline this, perceived in the person of Isaac all his hopes for the future. And therefore his hopes for posterity, the one kind of immortality he might have. But this is to say that even in the Bible, love is the counterclaim to God. That the Bible poses this moment as the contest between the authority of God and the authority of love. Now, if God is to be God, so says Soren Kierkegaard, then nothing mundane can count. And Kierkegaard says there must be a teleological suspension of the ethical. I have to say, for those who know me, I always say, I always find Kierkegaard abhorrent. That he could think he was defending something worth defending shows to me such a lack of anything I can recognize as human that I cannot follow him for even an inch. That's my problem, I guess. Although, please don't tell Professor Heller. I have to, have dinner and have drinks with her. For Hegel, right, the teleological suspension of the ethical, the willingness to suspend your sense that you are the other is the most important thing in your life, is the only test that you truly accept the authority of God. That one is willing to sacrifice what you hold humanly most valuable in the world. Now, the first thing to be said about this, which is important for everything we're going to read all semester, is that this makes sacrifice the type of relation between the claims of mundane particulars in relationship to any universal, any transcendent universal. That the very notion of a transcendent universal, whether in Plato or Kant or anywhere else, is always the sacrifice of the particular to it. In this case, the sacrifice is the sacrifice of the material world to the authority of God, which is the way in which you sever your relationships to the world. Abraham, Hegel says, achieves peace in accepting the necessity of sacrifice. And his heart, and I take this to be the most terrifying lines in Hegel, and his heart was quieted only through the certainty of the feeling that this love was not so strong as to render him unable to slay his beloved son with his own hand. That quiet heart. What is that? What is that certainty? What's the word we use for that certainty that quiets his heart? Faith. Faith. Certainly, all faith, as we now know, simply earnest. So the surest evidence of faith, what faith itself is the quiet self-assurance in the act of murder. And the more one loves the person to be murdered, the more certain is the faith. I think of there's two things. One, at the Morgan Library at the moment, there are some wonderful drawings and etchings by Rembrandt on show, and one of them is of the Abraham and Isaac story. And it's what's moving about it is the angel. The angel is grabbing Abraham with both arms to pull him back. What Rembrandt was thinking, this angel had to pull him off. Not to say, forget about it. No. It didn't work that way. And the other is a novel by James Hogg called Confessions of a Justified Sinner. Wonderful 18th or 19th century novel. Which is it? You haven't read it? Wonderful Scottish novel. Typical Calvinism. Again, a guy who hears the word of God and goes around, killing everyone. Of course, God stays Abraham's hand and Isaac lives. I take that fact to be irrelevant. Abraham and Isaac are, of course, still father and son. Only now, and here's the argument, so this is Isaac, only now their relationship is mediated through God, through God's command, and since the meaning of that command was the willingness to sacrifice Isaac, then that makes Abraham always the vision of the law, so the law of the father, and it makes Isaac, what every son really knows, is always dead. And his living is always a post-living. So now the question, to try to answer the Cotton question, nothing in this relationship is transformable. What could make the thing transformable is only the remnant of the love relationship itself. That's so that if we're Abraham to feel love, then he'd have a chance of doing something about this. But once you, so to speak, get into the position of faith, then you, so to speak, do the work of deseverance. Then you make yourself outside the human, right? You make yourself into someone who's willing to say, be a human sacrifice with a car bomb. I mean, just, the logic of this has become too real at the present to even think of this as merely a logical question. Right? We are seeing this played out literally on a daily basis. Okay. Any questions about that before I press on and try to tie it to Kant and to Jesus? Because, I mean, what Hegel does, why I say he's radical, is he's the first person I know of to tell the Abraham and Isaac story from the point of view of Isaac. I think maybe this is why I became an Hegelian. I wrote a...
How is it from the point of view of Isaac?
Because it's all about seeing things as, what is it like to have a father who's willing to kill you? What is it like to have this guy who says, look, I know you're not going to like this, but really, and what is, in Rembrandt, what does Abraham do? Abraham can't bear to look at what he's doing, so he covers Isaac's eyes. So the whole point now is this is the point of view of the son and not the father. This is the logic of the son rebelling against this patriarchal logic. That's certainly how I read it. Yeah.
Isn't it also the perspective, essentially, of the unbeliever? Because it seems to me that from the perspective of the believer, while the story stretches a kind of what they would regard as a kind of ordinary ethical relation, violates it, the other relation is such that it simply trumps this other one. And that's the way the believer would approach it. That's
of course.
the way believers continue to approach it.
Yeah.
So it seems to me you can only tell this other story, and this other story only resonates with you to the extent that you sympathize with or are, in fact, an unbeliever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, I don't know if that's necessarily so much Isaac's point of view, because there's plenty of Isaacs still walking around the world who justify and apologize for Abraham's actions and other people performing similar actions. It's more like our point of view, which is to say, the unbeliever's point of view.
But, I mean, really wonderful question. It really helps me say something about Hegel that's terribly important. Hegel does not think, and indeed it's not clear that Kant thought. It's certainly not clear that Plato or Aristotle thought. It's not clear that anybody but a few empiricists and a lot of analytical philosophers think that the job of philosophy is to refute the skeptic. You're rightly taking up what I would call the skeptics or the believers' point of view. I take it skeptics and believers are the same. I have nothing at all to say to the skeptical believer because I have nothing to work with. That's what I've been trying to show you. There's nothing to work with. Only their doubt, right? Only their possible love. So, of course, you want to say to the parent of a car bomber, don't tell your children to go blow up other people. Love your child and keep them alive. I mean, some primitive... But once that primitive notion is gone, I'm supposed to argue with them philosophically and tell them that, no, it's a logical mistake. Philosophy can't do that. Philosophy is not that powerful. What philosophy can do, right, is not refute the skeptic, but give us non-skeptics internal reasons, that is, ways of elaborating the internal ways in which we negotiate the world, give us reasons to think that we are rationally justified in having the beliefs we do. But you have to start already with something. So when I read Kant as beginning not with skepticism, but beginning with, we have knowledge of the world. How is that possible? He's not beginning with, we don't have knowledge of the world. How is it possible to have knowledge? You can't get from non-knowledge to knowledge. I don't think you can get from immorality to morality. This is not, as Hegel will argue in the Phenomenology, and as I'll try to show you in the Phenomenology has a logic not of logically defeating its antagonists, but a logic of, I want to use a religious word, it's the right word, conversion. What Hegel's interested in is the occasions in which we change our mind and how certain paths of activity can lead us to undergo a turning around. That's what a conversion is, a turning around, of coming to see things differently. So the entire logic of the phenomenology, as I'm going to present it, what Hegel calls, his notion of experience. The notion of experience is a notion of change, of conversion, not of logical inference or proof. Right? Philosophy, I said last week that the thing about philosophy that Hegel, the big system builder, Hegel who says something about everything, who rationally justifies the state and modernity and everything, what he shows you is the disappointment in knowledge. That you're not going to, as it were, get to solve the problems in the world by a little bit of philosophy. What philosophy can do is provide internal grounds for rational reassurance about a way of life, but you already have to be participating in that way of life. And insofar as, let's say, even the majority of our fellow citizens still believe they're living in the 13th century, prior to Copernicus even, what's going on there? I don't get it. But my not getting is not the point. You're right. They're not going to believe it. So you're right. What we're trying to do is what's Hegel beginning with here? Everyone feels, or not everyone in his generation, everyone growing up in the 1790s felt there was something rigid and authoritarian about Kantian morality. But something about Kantian morality was both inspiring but also abhorrent. Right? So Hegel's beginning right in the middle with this thought that we both are attracted to Kant, and we don't know why, and we are appalled by the categorical imperative. Do your duty. It just seems so cold. Right? Repress your desires, repress your sentiments, act for the sake of the moral law. Right? So Hegel here is taking the same line as Schiller and the Romantics, that something about this Kantian vision is problematic. And he's trying to provide a genealogy here, not that it's going to, refute Kant, but rather it's going to unlock the logic of our own responses, to give them a shape and form and intelligibility which will allow us to move on. But he has to begin with our sentiments. So I taught a course on Kant and Hegel for over a decade with Honora O'Neill, who is, without question, I think, the finest living defender of Kant's moral philosophy. And although over the years her Kant got a little bit more generous, she never believed me. She would defend Kant, and then I would give Hegel, and the students would go their own ways. But 10 years, the smartest woman I've ever met. She's scary smart. Really scary smart. Doesn't mean she read the same Hegel I did. She read Kant. She thought that any moral philosophy that was not action guiding and was not a form of decision procedure was useless. That was her starting point. And nothing within that, which sounds, you can say, look, what's the point of doing moral philosophy? It's not going to tell you what to do. That's what I thought. And I thought, what kind of weird moral philosophy is it that tells you what to do? So we have to find out. So the question is, what kind of logic is this? And this is a logic here that, as I said, it's genealogy. And it's genealogy that's trying to give us another perspective on our existing beliefs to allow us to transform out of them or transform them in a productive way. That's all we can do. If we can do that, we've had a good day at the office. We can go home satisfied. Okay. So this is a much more modest notion of philosophy. Even with all the system building and all that's what's going on. Certain Brandon uses a very nice phrase, making it explicit, taking the implicit logic of a certain set of experiences and practices and giving it conceptual shape. So we make explicit those sets of beliefs and practices we already inhabit. And I should say that, in my view, it's also what all art does, right? It's what novels do. So there are different logics of making explicit. Some of them are narrative. Some of them are representational. We call it making a picture. But they are all logics of making explicit little congealed moments of difficulty in human life. And philosophy is the version of that activity that does it with concepts. That's all. Okay? Yeah.
Speaking of congealed moments of difficulty, I don't want to get into the anti-Semitism question.
Sure.
But I know. But I think it is worth saying that Hegel's interpretation of the Hebrew Bible is extraordinarily distorted because, you really have to make a case that it's about command and obedience because that's, very far from it. But in particular, in the Abraham story, as I remember, in the sacrifice of Isaac, God is trying to get across to Abraham the idea of intelligibility as opposed to sensibility, as opposed to nature. And he takes the most natural and deeply felt thing in the world, the love of a parent for a child, and says there is something in that. Now, what else is idealism than the recognition of that, I don't know what to call it, transcendent character of reason? What else is spirit for Hegel other than that moment? What I'm saying is, does Hegel not reproduce the very discovery of mentality that he's attacking Abraham for? Doesn't he reproduce that? And say that he accuses Kant?
Right. That certainly is exactly the reading of Hegel I want to see if, this is my guess, I can avoid. That I don't think Hegel is that kind of idealist at all. Okay? But I absolutely agree there's a notion of idealism from Kant and Habermas and the like that says, no, this is the glory. The intelligible is the very thing we want. Now, my view of Hegel is that that's not his view of rationality or intelligibility. That he has a notion of experience that is the support of that, of which concepts make explicit a logic that's not itself conceptual. Right? Concepts make explicit a structure that is not itself merely conceptual.
Yeah, so just going back to this Abraham world God relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, essentially for the narrative that he's providing us within this text, it can go no other way. You can't get to the notion of faith and then the teachings of Jesus without going through this step. Right? So there's a sense in which you have to somehow have God after the divide.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's very important.
But if that's the case, then can we really condemn what's absolutely necessary for understanding?
We're not condemning. We're learning. I mean that Hegel is the first philosopher, again, who I know of, who says that only the whole is true, by which he means all the false steps you take to get there are part of the whole. Every false step, every mistake is necessary. And to see the necessity of the false steps is to see that they're not merely false. So, of course, I want to say that the power of this story is that this movement is both necessary and unnecessary. Why necessary? It's necessary because this is the logic of instrumental reason, and insofar as we are always going to be, in part, in a relationship to hostile nature, then there are relationships of mastery and domination that are going to be part of our repertoire. The mistake, which is for Hegel the paradigm of all philosophical mistakes, Hegel thinks that all philosophies, kind of there are too many halves, but are half true and half false. And what I mean by that is this, that Hegel thinks philosophy goes wrong by taking a partial truth and saying it's the whole truth. That the entire of the phenomenology, every moment in the phenomenology, is exactly that mistake. That is, it takes an insight, a real insight, and says that insight is everything. So we might say that all of philosophy is a series of metonymies. That is, a mistaking of the part for the whole. And that is the most human thing to do. Right? To mistake the part for the whole. So the mistake here is not that this isn't a part, that there's no instrumental reason, there's nothing like control or domination. And so when he starts with Noah, that gives you the necessity. When he says that Abraham left for no reason, that's the thought that that reason, that necessity, didn't have to become everything. That only under certain circumstances does that happen. And he explains roughly how it happens. So I absolutely agree. The power of this story, as genealogy should be, genealogy should not say that the beginning is arbitrary. That's why I don't like a lot of Nietzsche's of genealogies. It's all contingency. It's this story, that. That's no good. Good genealogy is to see that a moment where things go terribly wrong is almost unavoidable. Almost unavoidable. Not absolutely, because there's always contingency. But you want a moment of necessity. And the moment of necessity is the rational kernel. The rational kernel is the figuring out here of a certain logic. Namely, there is a relationship of universal and particular. Right? Hegel's not going to deny there are universals and particulars. Indeed, he's going to say we have to live the universal. He's going to discover a new concept of universality. He calls it the concrete universal. Whatever the hell that means, right? But he's not going to deny the universal. He's going to transform it because he thinks this logic, this version of this radical reification, the sacrificial logic, is only there because you've universalized something partial. So the story is not to deny its necessity. He wants to say, you're not crazy to think Kant had an insight. He really did have an insight. It's just that the insight is not the one he was hoping for. That it has this bad extra remnant in it that he didn't see. I'll say more about that in a second. Okay, let me say a couple of words about Jesus. Now, I'll say a couple of words about Jesus and then we'll stop. I just want to get going because it's a surprising things he says about Jesus, but it will help us kind of really get to the critique of Kant. According to Hegel, the initial, and this is really, talk about you would think that Jesus was a kind of David Hume figure. Jesus' initial gesture is simply to set the claims of human needs against the law. So, if he can show that human needs trump, even for the religious person, if human needs trump religious commands sometimes, then no command is absolute or unconditional. Right? So it's a logical argument about Jesus. And the example he gives is the example of when an animal falls into the pit, it demands instant aid even on the Sabbath. This is a radical thought. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. You're supposed to put your legs up, go to temple, then you put your leg up, have a little chicken. So. Well, what happens if the animal falls in the well? You let it drown? Of course not. Of course not. Even if it's the Sabbath, you go and you save your beloved sheep. What does that show? It shows that there is a logic to human need that can trump the authority of religious law. And Jesus, of course, and of course the particular urgency here, again, sheep is drowning, the urgency is not the point. The urgency only reveals the nature of the need. So the urgency isn't the point. You save it not because it's urgent, but because it needs to be saved, irrespective of whether it's the Sabbath or not. But if that's true, then why should it be the case that law ever trumps need? So Jesus has his disciples show general contempt for the Sabbath, that they pluck ears of corn in order to satisfy their hunger, even if that hunger could be satisfied otherwise. Hegel says, page 207, the satisfaction of the commonest human wants rises superior to actions like these, religious ones, because there lies directly in such a want the sensing or preserving of a human being, no matter how empty his being may be. No matter how empty his being may be. You see your fellow hungry. If your first question is, do you deserve food? And you giggle. Why do you giggle? We do this all the time. We ask if people deserve to be fed. If we can, we bring, but they're hungry, and the question isn't whether they deserve to be fed. If there's hunger, to recognize it as hunger is simply to recognize they need food. Full stop. Any further thoughts are a rationalization of that hunger into some wider, and Hegel thinks, overly rationalized set of concerns. So his thought here is that the satisfying of a need is an internal correlative of seeing it as a need. That is, what it is to learn that someone has a need is to see that a certain satisfaction is asked for. Now, the way I'm trying to describe this, I'm trying to avoid a particular word. And the word I'm trying to avoid is the word ought. The word ought, I'm going to argue throughout this course, has no place in morality. That the logic of ought, you ought not to kill, you ought not to covet your neighbor's wife, you ought to feed the hungry. If there's ought, then something inhuman has come on top of something human, is Hegel's view. Now, what we think of morality is really anti-moral. Now, in order to think about this, you have to think that there's an internal logic to human needs, wants, satisfactions, to human doings. And when I say internal logic, I mean what I was just suggesting. You see the animal drowning. The question is not, ought the animal to be saved? The question is, what is it to accurately perceive an animal drowning? Right? And Hegel wants to say the only reasonable description of that is you save it if you can. In fact, to see an animal drowning is to see something that needs saving. That's what it is to perceive it as drowning, as hungry, as needful. So Jesus here is suggesting that we don't need to obey the law. What we need, this is what we'll have to puzzle out for Steve, is what he calls love of thy neighbor. But love of thy neighbor, I'm going to suggest, is nothing more than the internal logic of learning the meaning of ordinary human concepts. And his love of the neighbor is simply learning what it is for someone to be hungry, or alone, or bleeding, or ill, or unhappy, or happy and joyful and satisfied. That is itself, let's call it an ethical logic, all by itself. I see Paul smiling. And why is he smiling? Because he's thinking, oh, that's what every novel and every play says. That literature is just about how the deepest human relationships unfold by an internal logic without morality on top. And learning that internal logic is how we, as it were, make our way through the world, not by learning principles and norms and these abstract objects. So there is here a, let's say it, what Hegel is bringing up here is also a certain contestation between philosophy and literature, which is why I bring this up. So it's no accident that all this is arising in a narrative setting. It's no accident that Hegel is going to give us something new in the way of how to do philosophy. He's going to call it phenomenology. That this phenomenology is going to be descriptive and not deductive or inductive. That we're going to have to figure out a way of thinking about concepts now that gives them a different shape than they have had previously. Yeah?
For Hegel, then, does the highest form of ethics eliminate choice? What I mean is...
Great question.
I mean, I can tell, I was in Washington Square the other day, bought me some food, walking across the field, this guy was laying down, and we made eye contact. He was like, "Can I have some food?" And I screamed across the thing, "I'm hungry too." And I walked off, but as I was walking off...
You felt like shit.
Right. I felt like it wasn't a choice. I went back and gave him food, right? But it wasn't an internal kind of deliberation, I ought to do this. It was, I can't do anything else. I need to do this. So does that eliminate?
Certainly, have to be very careful here. I want to say two things, and I'll stop because people are really getting crazy. The two things are the following. First, that there is an official line in Hegel where learning about freedom is learning necessity. So there's a bit of Hegel that takes this kind of classical rationalist view that freedom is simply learning what's necessary. Now, by that, he does not mean, this is the second thing I want to say, that there is no contingency in their choice. Why? Because the secret word I used was learning. So, of course, we can fail to learn. We can be blind. We can harden our hearts. So we're not going to have a logic like Leibniz of necessity, right? Not everything is going to be necessary here at all. But yeah, there's a way in which he will want to describe a sense of necessity or inevitability about these things that seem to make the notion of choice not important. So that it's going to be, in that sense, highly cognitive. Cognitive because it's an amount of recognizing adequately or adequately acknowledging or seeing perspicuously or lucidly and the like. But it turns out that that's immensely difficult. Okay, before anyone loses another ounce of sweat, we'll stop there, and we will finish with this text next week.